Welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. And a very special episode for us here today. It is our 100th episode. And looking back at all of our episodes prior to this point, it's amazing to think about all the people and things we've talked about when it comes to Virginia and its past, present, and future. But in looking at this, there was something that came to mind which was rather lacking, and that is, within 100 episodes, there's one time period of Virginia's history that we have sadly neglected. But in today's episode, I believe we'll more than make up for it. For that symbolism of 100 certainly seems to go ahead and make itself known. For in today's episode, we're going to be talking about those first 100 years of Virginia's history. Our guest today, Mr. Jim Thompson, is author of the book, The Birth of Virginia Aristocracy, and we're going to be talking today about those first 100 years and the people who made that such an interesting time period. So Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Virginia's aristocracy is always an interesting group of people when you look at them. I mean, we know about all the famous 18th and 19th century names, but you don't think about the 17th century too much. And so, what can you tell us about this group of people that form the aristocracy?
Well, it's a commonly used term, and most people are comfortable in thinking in general abstractions about the Virginia aristocracy, but it's actually quite a specific group of people. And I thought maybe I would begin by making a couple comments about how it formed in the organizational part of the colony. There were three important moments for the development of Virginia's aristocracy. The first occurred in July of 1619, I think is the right date, and that was when the first Virginia legislature met. The Virginia legislature was a body of 22 primary individuals from, I think there were 11 communities at that time in Virginia. That legislature continued to meet until the death of James I. And in 1625, the next important moment occurred, and that was when the new king, Charles I, abolished the legislature. The colony was growing. It was producing tobacco in an ever-increasing volume, and there were more and more English immigrants that were coming to grow tobacco and making themselves wealthy in the process. And the governor of the colony needed to be able to interact with them in order to influence local events. And so he created a ever-increasing set of positions. There were commissions, there were customs collectors, there were militia colonels, there were sheriffs, quite a few people like that. And all these people ended up coming together in a community of peers that set the stage a few years later. During the English Revolution, the colony elected its first Native American governor, English-born or English governor in Virginia. And when the Restoration began in 1660, Governor William Berkeley was named again to be resume his post as governor. And during the 17 years of his second term in office, he essentially created a network of close associates who did form the aristocracy that we know today as Virginia's aristocracy.
Now, when you say Berkeley, one of the things that is interesting to note is that the English are very peculiar in their pronunciation of words. And so as soon as you said the name, it occurred to me, I read Berkeley. So it's pronounced Barclay first.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a very understandable mistake that a lot of folks would make because we just read things straight across without that. Now, for Governor Berkeley, you say he created this network of associates. Now, how many were there in this group exactly?
Well, I think that there were 20 or 30 primary people. What he would do, the way that the government was structured, there was a legislature of elected officials. They would be equivalent to our House of Representatives today. They were elected by male landowning individuals of 21 years of age and older, and they chose a few among them to be privy councilors. And the privy councilors were invariably the wealthiest, most influential members of the widening community of Virginia. And they would have been men like, for example, Richard Lee. The Lee family was established. The Carters, William Carter, King Carter was a prominent figure by 1660. There were Wormleys, Burwells, Blands, Birds, all these names of families we know today. The Randolphs was a prominent member of this circle. And so they were his closest associates. And what he would do for them, these individuals, he wanted them to support his policies. And he had a couple of particular pet projects he was interested in. And he would appoint them, give them privileges that allowed them, make grants of land to them, so that they could enrich themselves and make themselves more influential in their communities. And he would then appeal to them to support his policies. And so maybe 20 or 25 men would have been the inner circle that he created.
And now, would they all have just been friends, or would they have just been, because of their wealth in general, it was kind of like a business agreement that they would work to almost keep raising themselves up?
Well, by the early 1660s, these particular families that I'm describing, most of them had been around for at least 10 and some 20 and 30 years. Many of them came during the English Civil War, which completed essentially with the beheading of Charles I in 1649. But these men understood power. Virginia was a society and a state that was created to make money. It was a money-making venture. And these men were there to make money, and they understood the importance of the relationships they had with each other. And so by the 1660s, they were actively marrying their children off to each other's siblings or children. And so they had these social connections. But Berkeley was also a shrewd politician. Berkeley, I'm sure you know, was the essentially a victim of Bacon's rebellion in 1677. And Bacon represented an outer fringe of itinerant individuals and lower gentry who objected to the hegemony of William Berkeley's circle. But Berkeley was busy trading off privileges to people not only who were his friends and associates, but people in this circle who he thought would help him to accomplish his objectives.
Now, in talking about Bacon's rebellion, this is something that a lot of folks might not know enough about. And you talk about, this lower group gentry opposed to the way that Berkeley was basically picking and choosing his favorites. Now, can you kind of briefly explain the importance of the role of Bacon's rebellion and this early period of Virginia history? Yeah,
it's a very interesting story. I mean, we are inclined to think that it was one big happy family. Everybody arrived in Virginia, they elected their representatives a few years later, and then everybody just worked together. Virginia society was stratified from the first footfall. When the London Company sent the first boatloads of settlers over, there were individuals that were owners of the shares in the company, and they had purchased the right to come to the New World to find treasure. They weren't obliged to do any of the heavy lifting. There were members of the company who were providing, they were soldiers and other officials in the company whose job was to manage the company's interests, while the wealthiest shareholders were out hunting for gold. But the most prominent group of people in Virginia for the first 30 or 40 years were indentured servants, people that couldn't afford to come over, pay their own way over to the colony. And when they couldn't, if they came, the company would pay their way for some of them, or some of these individuals I've named, like the Lees or the Birds. I guess the Birds did that, and others would pay the way of other individuals who were then there and owed them a service. When the indentures were up, typically not more than 7 years later, these individuals were on their own. And usually that meant that they could continue to work for a Lee or a Bird or a Randolph or someone like, or they could go and settle themselves somewhere and make their own fortunes. And when they did that, they moved to the perimeter of the community. In other words, they were moving up outside the Williamsburg area, the Middle Peninsula area, and they were moving up the James towards Henricus and towards Richmond. And these were the people that gravitated around Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon came in 1673. He was a cousin of Berkeley's wife. He was welcomed into the inner sanctum by Berkeley. He was an irascible character. He had property down Route 5, what is today Route 5, near Deep Bottom, which was where the Union Navy anchored during the Civil War. And he was concerned, supposedly, about the conditions facing that these itinerant members of the community had, and they rallied around him in order to persuade Berkeley to create a more favorable Indian policy, quote unquote, which was to pacify the areas for these lesser individuals so they could prosper in the Virginia Commonwealth. And that was the conflict. That seeded the conflict that led to Bacon's rebellion.
Now, when it comes to this rebellion, it didn't last very long, now did it?
No. Well, Bacon, a year or so, he was very successful in the beginning. He surrounded Jamestown. The capital was still in Jamestown. If you go to Jamestown today, where the little center is, there's a little museum on the island near where the fort is, and there's the foundations of the capital that was built during Berkeley's era are still there. Mm-hmm. And Bacon surrounded it. He had 500 or 600 armed partisans with him, and he threatened to burn down the capital if Berkeley didn't give him authority to make war on the Indians. Berkeley risked his life, but then he capitulated, and so the Capitol grounds are still there. Bacon went out, made some efforts at suppressing the violence on the perimeter of the colony. Berkeley came after him. They warred for a little bit. Bacon was successful in defeating Berkeley in the early parts, burned his house down. His house was in a place you can still visit called Green Spring, which is very close to the Jamestown Visitor Center, if you've been there. and the Jamestown Yorktown Center. And so after he had made trouble for all of the primary figures in Virginia, he dropped dead of the plague or something, I forget. Nobody quite knows what became. And when he died, the rebellion died with him. Yeah.
Now, considering that Governor Berkeley had basically 2 terms as governor, based on what you said, he's kind of almost like an early Talleyrand in that he's able to survive 2 very difficult time periods when, you know, if you're the man who's wearing the crown, you might discover a very interesting weight loss method. And so what do you think is the reason for his being able to, you know, kind of rise above all of the, you know, potential usurpers that would have taken it away from him?
Well, that's a very good question. Berkeley came to the colony. It was appointed by the king to be a governor in 1642. And he was very diligent he was the governor until 1652, when the Commonwealth, the representatives of the Commonwealth who had beheaded Charles the First, sent their commissioners over. And he then surrendered the colony, and he surrendered his post, and he went into retirement. For one reason or another, they didn't exile him or shoot him. They let him stay in his estate. And he was successful in his first term, this 10-year period, because it was a period of time when there was a great deal of prosperity in the colony. Tobacco was a prosperous product to grow, and people were minting money. And he was a good, loyal servant of the king. When he came back in 1660, conditions were much different. Charles II was broke and didn't have the outreach power to control the colony. Berkeley had a vision for what the colony should be, and we're thinking in terms of today's politics, there are all of these agents that are the worms in the woodwork, so to speak. Berkeley was very good about suppressing them. And he did that by, if he saw someone who might become a rival, he co-opted them and brought them into his circle and gave them positions, and maybe he'd send them to England as a commissioner, and he'd get them out of the way. So he was a very shrewd politician. But one of the most interesting things I think about Berkeley is that during this 17 years, when he never had an election, he governed Virginia during this time period, and he appointed all of the individuals who served in the House of Burgesses. And what he was doing was creating a fiefdom for himself. And he was supported in that by building this network of important people who controlled the local, the increasingly broad counties. And what he would do is he would he would make a man the prominent member of a community. He'd make them a member of his privy council. And then he'd also appoint them to be the justice of the peace, the county justice. And as the county justice, these people were monarchs in their own communities, and they controlled everything. They controlled the elections, they controlled collecting the taxes. In other words, he had this network of allies that controlled the whole colony, and he was successful. There was one thing that came up, and it's a fascinating story in its own right, and that is the Northern Neck Proprietary. You've probably heard that. I mean, it's a wonderful place to visit. That's where Stratford Hall is. Mm-hmm. It's where the Carters were. Nominee Hall is there. There are lots and lots of historical sites you can still visit. But the Proprietary was under the control of Thomas, 5th Lord Fairfax. And these county justices were increasingly prone to align with Lord Fairfax rather than Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And this created some minor conflicts that didn't blossom while Berkeley was still governor, but created issues later on.
Now, when it comes to Berkeley, you were saying like all these individuals were that he had appointed as the justices and judges. They basically became their own little fief kingdoms. Now, you had mentioned King Carter, and King was his nickname, not his actual part of his birth name. So now, since you had opened that door a little bit, how did he get that name King as a result?
Well, his father came to the colony of Virginia, I think it was in the 1630s, and he lived near where the bridge goes across from Saluda to Whitestone, I think it is, Kilmarnock, and in Westmoreland County. So he was there trading and raising tobacco when the Northern Neck Proprietary became active, and that was after the restoration of Charles II. And what happened was Charles II, the proprietary that he gave to Lord Fairfax was kind of like an empty apartment building. In order for Fairfax to make money out of it, people had to live there, and they had to pay him a quit rent. They had to pay him a monthly rent or a yearly rent. And so he found a land agent, and he found several, but one of them was Carter. And he would go, King Carter's job was to go up and down the community and appeal to the tenants, or the people that were living on the land, and asking them to pay their quit rents to Fairfax. Well, most of them weren't interested in that. But what Carter was smart enough to do was when he found a nice parcel of land, instead of trying to find some person to come live on it, he rented it himself. And when he finally died, I think he died in 1712, and when he died, the new Lord Fairfax is sitting in his London club reading the obituaries and finds out that there's King Carter, and he was wealthy because he had 300,000 acres on the Northern Neck. And Fairfax you can just imagine him crumpling the paper and going, my Lord, I could have that money myself. And he appointed his nephew, I'm simplifying the story, but the bottom line was that his nephew ended up taking over the collections of quit rents. That was William Carter of Belvoir, where Fort Belvoir is today. If you drive in there, and someone will come to the gate and ask you what you're doing, and you can tell them you're going down to Belvoir, and you can drive all the way down to the foot of the fort and walk through the forest, and there's the remnants of Fort Belvoir, which ultimately was the home of Sally Fairfax, who married George Washington, or was George Washington's friend. But King Carter had the foresight to take the best land for himself, and then, of course, not only did he have all the land, but he was getting quit rents from people that were growing tobacco that he was making a share interest in.
So it's definitely a way, it's almost like the J.R. Ewing of the 17th century in a lot of ways.
Yes, it was, very much like that.
And so, now, there's one term that you had mentioned earlier, and it's one of those things where, in talking about the aristocracy, and since you have such a depth of knowledge in this, and perhaps it'd be great if we have some clarification. You had mentioned the gentry. And I know a lot of times students, they hear about the gentry class in Virginia. Can you kind of give us what would be the understanding of what the term gentry is in relation to aristocracy? Are they one and the same?
Well, if you read the early records of who came to Virginia, I was just doing some research. It turns out that one of my forebears came to Virginia in the 1630s, and he's referred to as Richard Thompson Gentry, or gentleman. Now, what did that mean? Well, that meant that I think it's correct for him, but it was certainly correct for other people, that, as I said before, people could come to Virginia by paying their own way. And in 1619, Virginia set up something called the headright system. And the headright system attracted productive people to the colony by offering them, if they paid their own way, they could get 50 acres for every individual for themselves and every other individual whose transportation they paid for. And so Richard Lee, for example, brought 20 people with him. And he got 1,000 acres, which he settled on the Northern Neck. Now, he was a gentleman. He ended up owning thousands and thousands of acres. King Carter topped out, I guess, at 300,000 acres. My forebear might have had 100 acres. And he would have been considered gentry, but he wasn't aristocracy.
Okay.
So there's this, it's a gradation. It was just a question of magnitude, I guess.
Okay. Well, it's certainly an interesting thing to consider. And in looking at the first 100 years of Virginia history, there's a great deal to consider. To learn more about the early days of Virginia, please visit our website, www.timetravel21.com. Or if you have any questions, email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. This has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. And we hope you tune in again for our next 100 episodes and learn more about this Commonwealth.